Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Logos Roundtable. I have Caleb Thomas with me, and Rod is joining us tonight. We're going to have a discussion on gravity and dig down into the theory and history of gravity, the proponents of gravity. What is gravity? What is really holding us down? Is it a sucking us? Is there a sucking holding us down to the earth? Is there a pressure from above pushing us down, more like like when you're in the ocean? Why is gravity something that only exists on the land? As soon as you're in the water, gravity doesn't apply anymore. And so we're going to be discussing all of these things today. Welcome back, Caleb.
Thank you.
And welcome, Rod.
Hey, thanks for the invite, Jan.
You're welcome. So, Rod, he's been checking out the show, and he's got some information on vacuums, which sort of goes with gravity, and of course, gravity, vacuums, barometers. In the show notes, we've got a couple of videos there. One is the history of barometers. The other one is the knitting pen experiment, which are both very interesting. Hello, everybody in the chat room. And so anyway, we're just going to do sort of a easy Sunday show, sort of expose how the modern theory of gravity is nonsense and like so much else, mostly promoted by Royal Society type figures, whom we've also exposed already as a massive pseudoscience organization that controls the peer review system, etc. So anyway, where shall we begin? How about I let you start off there, Caleb?
Yeah, so we decided to stick with the gravity topic for tonight because we actually got a lot of really good feedback. I personally got a lot of good feedback in my emails. A lot of people really liked where we were going with our last show. We just kind of wanted to go a little bit deeper and address a couple of the misconceptions out there for the arguments. People are still trying to figure out what actually is going on. We're kind of to the point where we understand, they made up this whole theory of gravity, possibly, as a form of taking us away from technologies and an understanding of our universe and our the way things work. So we kind of want to dive into that a little bit more. I was telling people to go follow all these links. Not a whole lot of people followed any of the links. A lot of, some people did, but the people who commented on some of the videos, that seemed kind of, they were almost trolling. I don't know if they were trolling or if they actually were confused or but a lot of people are saying, this sounds like pseudoscience. The theory of gravity is well established. We know all of this, and we're trying to get people to think. We're trying to get people to think critically, and so I kind of wanted to go back into it a little bit deeper, read a little bit of the paper because a lot of people had a hard time reading it themselves. So I'll go a little bit deeper into that and kind of expound upon some of the concepts I was trying to get across earlier. So with that. I wanted to kind of say right off the bat, I kind of try to stick to these rigorous definitions. So I want people to think in terms of this rational scientific method. Rationally, when you start to think of a theory, and as soon as somebody starts coming out with a theory and they start using words like a force, red flag should pop up in your head and say, wait, hold on. What is a force? A critical thinker is not going to just, think, okay, a force. Yeah, that I can imagine a force. What is a force? Because to a rational thinker, a force isn't a thing. To force is a verb. It's an action, right? So there's no such thing as a force. We need to get that out of the. So gravity, they right off the bat, they start describing gravity in terms of force. This isn't Star Wars. We're not raising, spaceships out of the swamp with our mind. We don't have such a thing. We have to use our rational thinking to come up with our theories so that we can all understand what exactly is going on. And in order to do that, we need to know what physical object is mediating the phenomena. Okay, so force is not what something is, it's what something does. Okay, so what is causing the phenomena? That's what we need to get into. Okay, so start thinking in terms of what exactly are they talking about when they talk about their theory, because if it isn't rational, then you shouldn't waste any time on it any further. You should stop right there, redefine it in terms that we can all agree on so we understand what's taking place, and then build a theory, build a hypothesis based on rationality. Okay, so another thing I'd like to say, a lot of people are talking about Nikola Tesla, and I want to make sure I drill it through people's head that yes, Nikola Tesla was a very smart man. I you know I I would much rather have Nikola Tesla be studied with Einstein alongside of him. Like, unfortunately, we don't get very much Nikola Tesla in the college universities and the academia, but some of the things that you do need to know if you are studying Nikola Tesla, you need to know he definitely did not believe in the same type of a theory of gravity that the establishment did. So here's a quote. One of the quotes that I have in the beginning of my article. This is from Nikola Tesla. A good example for such an interaction becomes apparent in gravitation, which should rather be named universal compression. And I believe, this is me, side note, I believe he kind of got some of his concepts from a scientist named Walter Russell, and who we can talk about a little bit later. But back to the quote. I think the material bodies do not gravitate between each other, but it is the ether that makes one material body press to another. So he's right off the bat, he thinks it's an inversion, it's a pressure, a compression. And so the last part of the quote is we wrongly call this phenomenon gravitation. Okay, this gravity that everybody's talking about, to make the theory of in general relativity work, is an inversion. It's not a word we need to use anymore. We don't need the word gravity. We already have a word that better fits all of the observed phenomena, all of the mathematical physics equations. We don't need to invent something extra and put it in here and jumble everything up. We already have the terminology that best describes, and we'll get into a little bit more of the terminology. But as far as I just really wanted to quickly mention, I do have issues with Nikola Tesla. He was an amazing inventor, but he maybe didn't postulate his theories in a rational way that he could have. And I think that deserves more a deeper look into it. I think we should take all these scientists and all their theories, and I think we need to put them on the chopping block. Nobody's sacred. This isn't a religion. Like the scientific community has turned into a religion. We don't want to follow along those same lines. So as far as trying to figure out what theories, I'm not gonna go too deep into all the scrutiny I have against Nikola Tesla. I just wanted to mention that. Also with Walter Russell, I do have a little bit of I take issue with a couple of Walter Russell's theories. I have no problem going deeper into that. I don't think we'll have time in this show, but if you want to email me, I'll be happy to talk more about that. But okay, so let's move on just a little bit, so I can expound on some of these theories for people. So let me paint this picture for you. Okay, so if we live in a world that is all different density, okay, so if the atmosphere, and the higher you go up into outer space, there is less pressure until you get up into a vacuum, is the theory. I can't tell you that there is a vacuum up in space or not because I haven't been there. And as a critical thinker, I need experience before I, confirm or deny, some of these things. So I will just throw that out there. But so you start with low pressure and you build up to high pressure. You get to the ocean, and then the ocean is kind of a blotch wall of a magnet. If you kind of think of the way the pressure above and below kind of mirror each other in certain ways. Don't apply that as a law of physics, but just think of it in terms, because if you take a basketball that's full of air and you drop it from a building, it's going to fall. But if you drop it into a pool, it floats. And if you take that same basketball and you put it under the water, and it'll try to get back up to the top. So we're talking about buoyancy. We're talking about density. We're talking about viscosity. These terms already explain the phenomena we observe. We don't need to invent all these other terminologies. Okay, so imagine little water particles evaporating out of a lake, going against gravity, right? They're going against gravity up into the clouds. People would say, oh man, that's anti-gravity if it was a larger object. But because you can't see it, you're like, oh.
But when you realize pressure and different gases and things like that, and then you can see, oh, well, if it's changing into another gas, it's going to rise up through that to its level of buoyancy. But, it's like, salad oil and different types of fluids like in your article. And then when you see that at that position, then you can say, oh, okay, well, it's changing it's changing forms, it's changing into this other gas, so it's going to go to its next level where it's where it fits, where it's supported there. So,
Exactly.
and thanks, Go Coochie Chai, for the $10 donation there. So, Rod, do you want to jump in and add anything to that?
Sure. So what brings me to this particular conversation is that I went to college and studied mechanical engineering. And one thing that happens when you study engineering is that you get this very thorough exposure to the mathematical modeling that we are told, is the basis for Newtonian science, for instance. I finished college in 1983, North Carolina State University at Raleigh. And, after that, meat grinder of an experience, cramming for the exams, and finally I get out. And I didn't really feel like that I was in any way properly educated. I didn't, feel that the goal had been accomplished. So, much like you guys, I went off on my own sort of intellectual exploration and ended up spending a lot of time reading in the history of science and the history of mathematics. And of course that, overlaps with the history of astronomy in a big way. So, specifically though, what I read was stuff that is commonly available. I didn't do much research at all. Well, none in original sources. Okay, so what I'm familiar with is kind of the story as it is told, and the mathematical modeling as is practiced. One thing that I got from Goethe, an epistemological axiom that I turn to quite a lot, is the notion that if you want to understand something, you need to see it in its process of becoming. You need to see the whole context of its development. And one thing that I mentioned when we talked earlier today was the idea that the modern conversation about gravity is radically contextually depleted from where it was, say, in Galileo's day and previous, okay, according to some sources, okay. And my primary source on this is a book that I cannot recommend highly enough. It's called Man or Matter, and it was by a guy named Ernst Lehrs.
Mm-hmm. I have that book.
Okay, if I'm stuck on a desert island, with only one, that's still the one I'm working on. And what he presents in there is the idea that in the classical model, the model that came from, the Mediterranean cultures, and we, I say we, right, European culture took on, and et cetera, that in that model, the context was that, we're on this flat plane with this dome over the top of it, right? That was the model, the epistemological context. And we see something, and you were referring to it earlier, Caleb, and you guys talking about buoyancy and viscosity and all this. Okay, we noticed that in our experience that if we drop something that's heavier than air, it goes that way, right? And if there's something that's lighter in air and we let it go, it goes that way. Okay, and in the classical model, okay, there was gravity, the tendency of things to move that way, and levity, the tendency of things to move that way. Okay, so it was both. Okay, and so the what's sometimes referred to as Goethean science, they kept both gravity and levity in their model. And the Goetheans say that Newton talked about the apple falling, but he never talked about how it got up there in the first place.
Mm-hmm. How does the tree grow against gravity?
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Because in the classical model, there was this levity concept that described that. Okay. So, for instance, in an alchemical context, if you wanted to increase the levity of a substance, say you had a hunk of cinnamon or something and you want to increase its levity, you ground it. Okay, you would grind it up into a powder, right? Makes it lighter, right? More surface area per volume, right? And in their context, that would be, giving it levity. Okay, so in Man or Matter, what the story that Lairs tells anyway, is that Galileo had these, what I'm sure must have been really startling results when he was doing his experiments with gravity and rolling balls down inclined planes, right? They would let these balls roll down these planes and count off time and see what mathematical patterns they could find. And so he had, remarkable success in that, as trivial a thing as it is, right? I mean, there's so much more in life that's more important than, putting numbers on these physical motions. But anyway, so the story goes, a group of Galileo's proteges created a think tank called the Academy of Cimiento. And you can find that.
And after this point, we're going to pass it back over to Caleb.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Great point on the Man or Matter. One of my great friends, Thomas Joseph Bound, turned me on to Man or Matter a while ago. I haven't finished it. I'm gonna, now that you mention it, I'm gonna have to get back and I'm gonna have to get back to it. So I wanted to just say that for people to kind of understand where I'm going with this whole thing is, imagine that you don't have one without the other when you talk about each one of these layers of density. Okay, people, they used to get, back in the day, they used to get really confused. Like when they first came out with the barometer experiments, they were trying to figure out what the heck a vacuum was in the school of Aristotle. They were big arguments about, is there anything in air, and all these arguments. And unfortunately, we're still thinking in those terms today. We don't realize it, but it's kind of like the fish in the sea. The fish doesn't realize that it's in the water. It's like, what is water to a fish? It's kind of like what is air to a human being. So we tend to forget that you don't get one without the other. So imagine this. Imagine that there's an air bubble inside of a big, large body of water. Okay. The air bubble is, if you snapped your fingers and reversed it, it would be a water bubble in a big space of air. And then you snap your fingers back, and then it's try to visualize this. You don't have one without the other. This is the idea of balanced, interchangeable balance between likeness. So like always attracts like as far as potential goes. So if you think in terms of charge, you always have like potentials seeking each other. So if you can think in terms of, well, when the fish jumps out of the water and it comes up into air, it's the exact opposite of us going into the water as far as perspective goes. And once you start thinking of that, this idea of pressure that I'm explaining, hopefully that will start to piece things together for people. If you take a water, if you take an air bubble underwater and you pop a balloon underwater, the water is filling the void in that space, and the void just keeps going up. So think of the water bubble as just a void, okay? And that will begin to you'll understand what I'm saying when I start segueing into these other ideas. Does that make sense? Am I explaining that well?
Correct. And without the balloon itself, which allows the pressure to be held down, that's what's keeping it in the space to begin with. Otherwise, it's the pressure above in the different layers isn't enough to hold it down at all. So it just fills in, and that's in your. I'm just going to show that on screen again, this image here. So, something filling in something on one level, it's going to have to rush up to the top and be filled in by the other heavier elements or whatever the heck we're going to call them.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, when I am talking about the elements and, atoms and such things like this, I want it to be visualized that there is no separation between anything. Everything has a connection of some sort. That's why the concept of weight and motion and instantaneous action at a distance, all these concepts require the idea of tension. You don't get tension if nothing without some sort of a connection between everything. So everything is connected in a certain way. So just think in terms of there is no single thing in the universe. There is no singular thing. Everything is connected in a certain way. Okay, now when that water droplet rises up, when the water vapor rises up into the clouds form above us, and that's anti-gravity. We observe every single day. We observe this cloud, forming above us. And, just to touch upon it, if you think in terms of electricity, you'll start to understand concepts better, because electricity is the most understood form of communication that I can communicate it to anybody, because everybody kind of at least understands the basis of positive and negative charge, at least. Okay, and I definitely do not believe that electrons are flowing through our wires, and these singly charged particles come into our lights and then they light up. I don't believe that. But when you think of a water droplet rising up, think of it in terms of charge. So charge is, people say positive and negative charge. Well, what does that mean? Well, positive and negative charge can be likened to two different sides of the cycle. So there's a cycle, you can think of it in terms of spin, like the way Walter Russell describes it is inert gases spin faster and faster to create different densities and that's how the elements form. And the frequency of this spin determines the density of it. So this positively charged raindrop goes up in the cloud. It's positive, meaning it's charged. Negative just means discharge. There's no such thing as negative charge. You can't negatively charge your cell phone or negatively charge a battery. It has to either charge or discharge. So this water molecule goes up, and because it creates a different pressure condition, so it's going up into a different pressure zone. It goes up in the clouds form, the clouds get to a certain mass, the pressures build up. That's why the barometric pressure either rises or drops and affects weather. Then all of a sudden, when the water molecule falls back down, it changes charge. When it changes charge, that's why you see a discharge of electricity called lightning. And the energy has to go somewhere, and because it doesn't have anywhere to go, it arcs, and it's just an arc. Okay, now the way that the way that all these clouds move around the Earth, you wouldn't call them anti-gravity, would you? And how would the molecules be strong enough to go against the force of gravity, even though they do say gravity is a weak force? But how would this occur? This is an interesting question I have for people. But if you start thinking in these terms, hopefully you'll start to kind of grasp where I'm going with pressure, barometric pressure, pushing these different densities, and everything naturally forming in their rightful spot of density. People you can even liken it to buoyancy, but yeah. So do you have anything to say about that?
So am I up? Is that?
Yeah, go for it, Rod. Oh,
Okay,
and let me just say very quickly there, thank you to Polygonal Construction and Mondo Gonzo for their $5 donations.
To continue in the context build out in classical times, there was this other part of the story called levity, right? That is, fulfilling this role that, differences in buoyancy, fall under that rubric. We have the experience every day. You drop something on the floor, right? That does not require an explanation for me. Okay, any explanation is this building of levels of abstraction upon this empirical thing that we witness all the time. And I personally, don't have a whole lot of need for it. But what happened with the Academy of Cimiento, as I mentioned earlier, Galileo's proteges, they said, okay, the features of levity cannot be mathematized as readily as the features of gravity. So we're not going to talk about levity anymore. Okay, and that document, the Contra Levitatum, pretty much sealed the deal on levity, right? Because it doesn't show up in physics books, right? It's gone from the context. Okay, the context got dumbed down. Then, okay, Newton is faced with this mathematical exercise where, no longer is the context a flat plane where dense stuff moves that way, through our empirical observation. Now he's got this sphere, okay, and he's got to develop this math that tells you why you're stuck to it like a magnet. Okay, so it's a totally different context. And, when you look at the specific mathematical modeling of it, for instance, Newton's so-called universal law of gravitation, in order for those numbers to work in the way that we're taught it anyway, is that you have to model both, let's say, the Earth and the Sun as dimensionless particles that somehow contain the entire mass of that body. Okay, the mathematics has to be idealized in that way to be self-consistent, right? And geometry works that way. The old story about the apple falling and hitting Newton in the head. Well, the way the story gets told in the popular versions of the story, and I've read lots of popular histories of astronomy, is that the epiphany that he had was that the motion of this apple falling, okay, was similar to the motion of what had previously been known as the luminary, right, the moon, right, that those two were the result of the same physical context. And so, that's kind of the history of how it happened. And you guys, may well know as well that the story goes that Newton wrote up all this stuff in the Principia Mathematica, shoved it in his dresser, and it sat there for 20 some years, according to the story. And Edmund Halley, his protege, found it in his dresser and had it published. Okay. So, as Hawley, Hawley ran down the myth about the apple, where that first showed up, right? And I suspect that this Edmund Halley story is a myth as well. And certainly what you guys were talking about with regard to Indian mathematics, being brought to England, and those guys, studying that makes a whole lot of sense historically, go ahead.
I was just going to say, since you bring up the math side of it, just to touch on that for a second, one of the things that really gets me about
just
math.
So you know, you're not in the camera there, Rod.
Oh, thanks.
You were talking about how you went to school for engineering. I think engineering is probably one of the only reasons I would actually go to a university, would be to study engineering. The problem I have with the mathematics in physics is that most of the time what they're doing is they're trying to, this is just a completely irrational concept from the start to me. They're trying to take a quantitative language. Math is a man-made quantitative language, and they're trying to use it in a qualitative sense. And I think that is the reason why so many mathematicians go crazy.
Right.
There are a lot of mathematicians. Bertrand Russell, I believe, is one of them, who went completely crazy trying to figure out the concept of mathematics and how it applies to infinity. One of the silliest things that they try to teach you in relativity theory, and in black holes, for instance, you have to divide by 0, and then 1 over r minus 1 over 0 equals infinity is like the answer you get, according to Michio Kaku, right? So it's like, and these mathematicians themselves are all saying how irrational it is to have to use these, so they're inventing these concepts to fit into their model that they should have threw their model away a long time ago, because a qualitative theory can't have mathematics in it. Mathematics is just about counting. It's about trying to make a concept understandable so that you and I can communicate. It's a language, is all it is, right?
It's quantitative, not qualitative, essentially. Is that what you mean
exactly.
by that?
That's okay. Exactly what I mean. So in a sense, the reason why people are going crazy with trying to
get who, what numbers. They're trying to get who, what, where, and when out of a quantity, and then therefore filling in. They have to make up the grammar as they go, because they skipped over the logic part altogether in their entire theory and their formula.
Exactly, and that's why I say it's like they're chasing their tails in the dark. They don't have a basis to start. They skip straight over, and the mathematics, the concept of infinity drives mathematicians crazy, because mathematics. There is no such thing as infinity in reality. There is only the illusion of infinity. We can see this in manifest in all kinds of ideas like the multitude of universes, and you can keep zooming in and you can keep zooming out as far as you want, and all these ideas in quantum physics. And I think those are really a dead end, because when you try to apply, when you try to say something like nature is made with numbers, and you start thinking in those terms, it drives people absolutely crazy, because it you're taking something that's a language trying to describe nature and calling it nature's mechanism. And it's the same nonsense of how they have to make up math with all the new theories that keep
The
coming up.
same issue we see constantly. The map is not the territory, and they confuse the map as the territory itself.
Exactly.
That's the biggest problem I have with math. I mean, I could go. I have a lot of notes on mathematics, and the constant irrational ideas that mathematicians put forward. But I think a lot of the people in the chat, as far as I can tell, are already pretty savvy to that. So
Well, and let's not forget that others who might not be will watch this as well.
sure. Sure. So if anybody wants more information on the mathematics stuff, um, like I've been saying, I've been personally working on putting together a website that will have a lot more of this information. Until I get that going, I do have a ton of notes. Most of my material is collected from a lot of other people. I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I have no problem sending you links to all the stuff where I learned this stuff. So if you're new to this information and it's kind of over your head a little bit, you want me to expand further on certain topics, I have no problem doing that for people. I like talking about this stuff. So one of the other things that I wanted to mention real quick that Rod was talking about, the whole idea that we mentioned a few shows ago about Newton. I just wanted to throw this out there because a lot of people are trying to now give credit to the Indians for calculus. And I would just like to say, since I had that note, I gave that note to Jan, and I haven't looked into it in a really long time, and I just revisited it. That was something that I was into. This some of these topics. The last time I researched them was like 3 or 4 years ago, and because now I'm onto the flamenco stuff, and I'm so obsessed with like learning about history right now that I what I'm trying to say is I've found out that some of um, the flamenco stuff is now revealing that the Mahabharata, the ancient Indian, the Hindus, a lot of the language, all the old ancient, supposedly called ancient texts, are probably not what we think they were. So most likely they got most of their stuff, and they describe it in their epic as the Aryans, and everybody wants to know who the Aryans are. Well, Flamenco's saying it was the Cossacks. So, and that goes right in tune with what we were talking about earlier with Pythagoras not being an ancient Greek and Aristotle not being an ancient Greek, and they're actually in the Middle Ages. And for more information on that, I mean, that stuff is probably the most mind-blowing stuff. But
for those of you who aren't familiar with Anatoly Fomenko, and I still get emails about that all the time, I'm just going to pull his hold on a sec. Pull his books up here on screen, because people need to understand that it's such difficult information to get your mind wrapped around on a surface level. But so anyway, I think that's Fomenko there. But I was hoping to find some of his book covers there. But he's got over 50 or over 30 books in English. And some of them are these here, but he's got, I'm just going to pull it up here. All right. Sorry, folks. Here we go. This set here, you definitely want to read at least book 1 in this series. And there's 7 books to this series. He's got over 100 books in print in Russian, more than 30 in English. But definitely look into these. And people, again, they ask me about these constantly, so just look into this. It's a lot of reading to go through, and Caleb is diving through it. And once you begin to see it, Jacob Duelman and I did a series last year, year and a half ago, going into a lot of the research that he had done, and he found totally separate information substantiating Fomenko that Fomenko hadn't found, and researching Joseph Scaliger and the people associated with him and whatnot. So definitely go into the archives and check out those shows with Jacob Duelman as well.
Yeah, and I don't want to segue too far off of it because that's such a deep subject, and I know a lot of people are interested in more of that. So, and I'm spending a great deal of my time trying to put that stuff together. I'm definitely going to be interested in coming out with more information, but not to sidetrack too much. But just real quick for anybody who is kind of skeptical as to what I just said. Just a tiny little piece for you to kind of blow your mind for you to think about until the next time I talk about it. Go look at the story of Pythagoras and compare it to the story of Jesus. And there was a medieval original as well, but I won't mention that. But these are reflections, two different reflections of the same story, and that's what you get when you read flamenco. You get to see all these different reflections throughout history are actually talking about one specific event that actually happened, and all these people are writing about it using different languages and different translations, and some of the stuff is lost in translation. But go read the story of Pythagoras, his followers, all the stuff that happened to Pythagoras, and then go read the story of Jesus. You even find the story of the fish in there with the fishermen. I mean, anyways, that's not neither here nor there. But back to what we were talking about earlier. So some people in the chat are asking some really good questions here. One of the things I want to kind of put out there, because I wrote across this quite a bit with people who are interested in science. They say something like magnetism and electricity, or like electromagnetism, and they think in all these different terms, like, because the electric universe is popular, and I have some beef with some of the stuff that they put out. But as far as people's understanding of electromagnetism, I would just like people to consider that it's, in my opinion, magnetism is an electric phenomena. It's all observed phenomena that we can observe. We would be way better off if we just stick to what we kind of understand. And a lot of people think in terms of electricity. And thanks to some really brilliant people in the electric universe, a couple of people that wrote books about the electric nature of the body, and so a lot of people are thinking in terms of electricity, which I think is great, because it is very similar to the way that most people understand electricity, as far as positive and negative and charge and all these things. So electric engineers jump on, they kind of understand this stuff right off the bat. They're really savvy already. So if you think in terms of what are these forces? See, we have all these words to describe all these quote unquote forces, but that, in my opinion, that really confuses people, because you're using a whole bunch of different terminology to describe basically the same phenomena manifest in different sensory perception, right? So magnetism is electricity, in my opinion. So just to throw that out there, somebody said that in the chat here. Let's see. So people are asking about dark matter. Dark matter is something they invented so that they could make their theories work with the general relativity, because they got rid of ether. Einstein kind of had it in there in some of his ideas. He took it out. They wanted to separate Nikola Tesla's idea of what ether was from Einstein, so they invented different words like the luminiferous ether. Right. Then they started talking about what is it, the quantum foam. I mean, there's like a couple hundred different renditions all over but the idea is that everything is connected, and that there is nothing separate from anything else. So therefore, there is energy inherent in the quote unquote ether, even though I think Walter Russell had a little bit better of an idea of what ether was than Nikola Tesla. I know that's a large claim to make, but not to say that Walter Russell had the perfect idea either. I do like the criticisms of some of the things about Walter Russell, because a lot of people are very aware of him now, which is a good thing. But be very critical of certain things that Walter Russell says, like, for instance, just really quickly, there are only 3 dimensions. Okay, I will debate anybody that wants to try to talk to me about, no, there's more dimensions, there's parallel dimensions, there by definition there can be only 3 mutually orthogonal directions you can move in a cube. Anything outside of that is not a dimension. You can't say time is a dimension, because time is the measure of motion within 3 dimensions. So, you know, you got to be real careful with a lot of these things, like even some of the best researchers out there will still screw up and say, you know, this wave particle or something like this. Like, you know, that's why I believe it's very important to start with the rational scientific method first. Let's all get on the same page as much as we can, and then we can move on from there and start to come up with better explanations, because that's what science and physics is doing. That's the purpose of science and physics, right? Is to attempt to explain the natural physical phenomena that we observe.
Let's
Pseudoscience.
Rod, you want to jump in?
Sure. So in the context again of the gravity levity model, according to Layers, and this part really grabbed me, that in that model, magnetism was modeled as levity inflected gravity, and electricity was modeled as gravity inflected levity.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a very important distinction that's been made between electromagnetic phenomena and gravitational phenomena. You know, usually, you know, they run off this list of these elementary forces, right? But there are important distinctions to be made between them. And the big distinction between gravity and electromagnetism is that gravity cannot be shielded. Okay, electromagnetic phenomena can be shielded with lead and etc. Okay, but gravity cannot be shielded. Okay, fundamental distinction. So I've been thinking a lot about the whole gravity concept and all the claims that Newton made, and one that I've been focusing on lately is the notion that the moon is this ball up there that is somehow moving the water of the oceans around, right? The gravity of the moon is what is to cause the tides. Well, if you take Newton's universal law of gravitation and try to take that along with fluid mechanics and produce a tide table, okay, you can't do it, okay? You know, there are millions of people every day are looking at tide tables, these super accurate measurements of where the water level is going to be at any given time during the day. Okay, well, there's no way that Newtonian mathematics is being used to calculate that. Okay, absolutely no way. So some other system is being used. You know, in the same way, we know that Ptolemy predicted eclipses for 3,000 years in advance of himself. Okay, those sorts of calculations cannot be done with Newtonian mechanics at all. Your compounding mathematical errors just blow the thing up. So there's you know profound evidence right in our face that Newtonian mechanics, although it's given to be the explanation for why this stuff is happening, is not the theoretical basis on which all this stuff is coming together. Did I make that clear? Well, I'll go on a bit. So as you guys were referring to earlier, the notion of viscosity. If you're going to do any sort of mathematical approximation that's going to tell you how the moon is going to be pulling the water around, okay, well, from fluid mechanics, what we know, or what we're taught in terms of mathematical modeling, is that you need to know what the viscosity of the fluid is, and you need to know the mass of the fluid, and you need to know what sort of surface, and usually in the context of fluid mechanics, you're talking about flow through pipes. You need to know how rough the surface is. You need to know the shape of the surface. Are there a bunch of 90-degree, bends in the pipe? That's going to, drop the pressure a predictable amount. And so in the context of mechanical piping systems, you can make estimates of how the fluid is going to behave. This remarkably accurate. But to try and apply that to this notion that the moon is dragging the water around, okay, and that you can predict, changes in tide level within inches, does not compute. That does not compute. Although Newton has offered up, this gravitation of the moon thing to be the cause of the tides, they're certainly not using these mathematics to create those tide tables.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Hey, Rod, are you familiar with W.C. Wright? And he wrote a book. I mean, it's kind of old, but he wrote a book called Push Gravity, and he made a ton of 3D models. Man, you got to see it there. It's actually on YouTube. My friend Jason Verbelli actually put up all of the original films. I don't know how he got them, but they're old VHS films of.
Oh, neat.
He had a little museum where he took magnets, and he took magnets and put them on strings, and he put them on like toothpicks, and created models of the universe and recreated the exact same phenomena with magnets. And one of the things that he does is he takes the moon, or he takes a model of the moon, and puts magnets around it, and then he takes the earth and kind of uses it as a magnet, and he takes the north and south and plays with it until he can kind of make the magnets on the sides push more on the sides than they would if you thought that in the model that Newton comes forward with, the earth would be attracting the moon, and there would be one point that it would kind of be more attracted than the other. But that wouldn't account for how we have high and low tides. But when W.C. Wright makes this whole model, he creates the exact phenomena that we see, magnets pushing on the tides exactly how we observe it on the earth. And so it really makes you wonder if there's more of a magnetic occurrence. I mean, it should be a dead giveaway that we only see one side of the moon, right? So it would seem that there's some sort of a coupling there, right? I don't know if you haven't seen that, you got to look into W.C. Wright Push Gravity. It's how I formed most of my understanding and visualization of how the pressure idea. Because you really have an object of mediation in that sense,
Right.
You can actually look at a magnet, see a magnet push, and create the phenomena we observe. But yeah, so check that out. And then the other thing you were talking about, what were you saying earlier? I wanted to comment on it. Oh, I just forgot. Remind me, you were talking about something else right before that.
Well, I can't recall it, but let me interject this, because this is something that you brought up that I wanted to comment on. That was
Sure.
the concept of the ether,
Mm-hmm.
and where it fit in the classical model. Okay, so my understanding of the classical model that comes, that the Greeks exposited on a fair amount, was this notion of that we can model physical phenomena in terms of these different categories: earth, air, fire, and water.
Yeah.
Okay, and then they had the fifth, what they call the quintessence, right? Quin is the prefix for five. Okay, and the ether was understood to be the fabric out of which all that other stuff was made. Okay, it was a different level of structure in the system. Okay, and it was taken to be and understood to be the medium for light and for consciousness. Okay, so that was just the way it worked. I mean, that's the way their epistemological structure was put together. And it gave them, this modeling context for talking about consciousness, right? Which modern science attempted to do away with in some versions of the story. I read and reread, all the popular Einstein stuff, and it just never. I could never get my head around it. I mean, I could spout it out, but I didn't get it. And so, now I really don't ascribe to any of it.
I don't think it's understandable. I don't think anybody understands it. I think it's a completely
That's just like quantum physics. No two quantum physicists agree on the same points about it, because it's not understandable, and it's made to be that way. The observer affects the outcome of the observation and this type of stuff, so that no two people can ever look on it. But if you go out in nature, two people should always be able to observe something. It doesn't, if you're looking down at a tennis ball on the ground, it doesn't shift or do something because three people are looking at it from different directions, unless somebody uses, here's this term again, force upon the object.
Yep. So if you don't mind, I have a couple more things to get back to in the gravity article, just to kind of touch upon. So I've already mentioned this before, but I don't really like to think in terms of pull. I think Walter Russell was correct when he talked about there is only push. And I have a bunch of Walter Russell quotes that I have, just in case anybody is interested in those. But just one concept I'd like to get through to people a little bit deeper is that, so say we're talking about magnetism, and like I said, it's more of an electrical thing. And Rob kind of he hits on the first thing that most people go, well, hold on a second. How can magnetism should be described differently than electricity, because you have electromagnets, and you can make those work differently than you can observe, say, something like positive attraction between a metal and a like different materials. And some are dielectric. And what is dielectricity? And one concept that I'd like people to understand is that if you smash a magnet and you smash it into pieces, all those little pieces turn into little magnets, and they're all positive and negative.
North-south segregated.
Yeah, they're north-south segregated. Exactly. I don't necessarily believe in a block wall like a lot of people do. And I think if you're interested in, if that makes you go, well, hold on a second. Of course there's a block wall. Well, look at a magnet with magnetic viewing paper. You can see that there's a ring around the center. And it depends on if you're looking at a flat ring magnet or a bar magnet. But there's a guy on YouTube, or I guess they took his videos down, called Magnet Flipper. He used to take magnets, put them in a fish tank with a whole bunch of salt in there, and he used to put a charge to the base and then tap tap the actual magnet, and so you had a charge running through it, and you'd actually see a vortex
neat.
of bubbles coming out. So you could see, it's like, well, hold
That
on
was
a second.
inventive.
And and then he flipped it upside down, and it went. So one way goes centrifugal, and one way goes the other. And then the other really cool thing, a lot of people are well aware of now, thank God, because we've been sharing the crap out of Ken Wheeler's videos. Ken Wheeler has been making these really cool. I don't know, Rod, if you've ever seen these. They're these ferro cells. You put ferro fluid in a thin layer between glass, and you put LEDs all the way around it, different color RGB LEDs all the way around it, and then you hook the light up to it, and then you put a magnet up to it, and it makes a three-dimensional hologram of the shape of the magnetic field, and it's really cool. The picture of my Facebook is the actual picture of the magnet, but you can see that there's centrifugal divergence and centripetal divergence on the two. But anyway, so back to what I was saying. So the north pole of a magnet is positive. The south pole of the magnet is negative. Okay. Now we're going to start discussing what that means. Okay. So north pole of a magnet is spinning clockwise. South pole of a magnet is spinning counterclockwise. So centrifugal, centripetal. Okay. So, and it isn't just a spinning this way. When I say centrifugal and centripetal, think of you flash freeze water going down a drain. It's actually a compression. Okay. It's twin opposing vortices. Okay. So north is clockwise, like the path of the sundial, shadow telling time. Forward is increasing. An increase is a gain. A gain is putting more pressure. More pressure is positive. Okay. Like we were just talking about underwater. So the south is counterclockwise, and that is like the motion of a clock turning backwards. But just so you know, the direction of the spin doesn't necessarily mean that time is spinning backwards. Backwards is decreasing. Decreasing is a loss. A loss is less pressure, and less pressure is negative. Like space, we were talking about. Space is just less pressure. Okay, a vacuum. I don't necessarily know if you could actually say a true vacuum exists or not, because you'd have to go into outer space to do that experiment, really. But okay, so positive. When you think of positive, when I say positive, I'm saying there's these examples here that I'm going to give. Explosive. An explosion is a positive. Repulsive, radiative, discharge, decay, outward, acidic on the pH scale is more positive. Incoherent, chaotic, these are opposites of coherent and uniform. Hot. So positive, you can be likened when you get when you like say a motor runs on an explosion. One of the effects that you get is heat, right? So you change, you get a change in pressure, which causes heat. That's more of a male thing, usually, is a positive. When you think in terms of electricity, male is usually the outer thing that you plug into the female, just like a man or a woman would be a good example of that. Yin, yang. I'm sorry, yang is the positive, yin is the female, and I like that. I like the idea of the yin yang. I'll get into that more later. Centrifugal. Okay, centrifugal is positive. So that the idea of positive, it promotes virus and it promotes bacteria and it promotes hydrocarbons and it promotes pollutants. It causes burns. People would say that there's a lack of electrons, and we'll get into more of what electrons are. But so if you take a magnet, and this is just an idea. This is what I've heard a couple electric engineers mess around and try to describe what the phenomenon is with magnets, but there's actually some people who are starting to figure out that the north side of a really powerful magnet, the positive side, will actually increase the pain of an injury, but it also heals you quicker, a little bit quicker. Maybe not as noticeable as you'd like to be able to prove this, but and when you flip it around, the negative side of the magnet actually slows down the healing, but it also slows down the pain. It lessens the pain. And the idea of this is also found in nature, where you have, like, say you freeze, you can freeze a squirrel and put a squirrel in your refrigerator, and he can live. It slows your heart rate down, and you maybe live longer. But obviously it's a slowed down form of that. And then heat, accelerated heat, if you microwave a squirrel, the death cycle accelerates. So you have two cycles. You have a heat, you have a
gas pedal and a brake pedal.
Yeah, and it's the life cycle, and it's also in everything. And the life cycle is this moving. It's a cycle, so that it always returns back to where it was. So it is kind of like a circle. It isn't necessarily opposites. Like the Kybalion, I think, is one of the best distinctions I've seen, where it shows there's a big difference between polarities, which are like kind of opposites, and then there's also a scale like a thermometer. And the thermometer, you can't be like, oh well, this is where it's hot right here. You point to where it's hot and point to where it's cold. You can say, oh well, it's cold at freezing point of water, but it's a scale. So there's a distinction to be made here, where the life cycle that I'm discussing is it's like a guitar string. The guitar string is still. You string the guitar, it vibrates to its maximum potential, and then goes back to stillness. So everything seeks rest. So everything starts at rest and grows to more complexity, and then turns back. Okay, so the negative side of the cycle is negative, implosive, attractive. Which, when I say attractive, I mean, when I think in terms of pressure of attractiveness, pressure still mediates the electric effect of attractiveness. Pressure still mediates that. So compressing is as opposed to radiation and discharge. It's compressing and charging.
Yes, that's the gravity levity distinction again. Right?
Yes, exactly. And that's why we don't need to invent all these other. I'm giving these examples so you can see how many examples we already have. We don't need to invent this other language to try to describe it. And then it starts to
the old models are really, really effective ones.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And as far as I can tell, the big occult secret, is that fractal models work really well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, that seems to be, what's that, the foundation of all of it. And so, one of the expressions of that is this notion, so-called as above, so below. Well, as above, so below more than implies as below, so above, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
Of course. As within, so without.
So, for my money at this point, it makes much more sense to use biological metaphors to talk about what is up above us and down below us.
That's so funny. Jan and I were just having that conversation earlier today.
Okay, so what we're looking at, right, and this gets back to this whole notion of the so-called void or a vacuum. Okay, and where my attention got put on this initially was a book that changed my life, and that was Science and Sanity by Alfred Korzybski. My primary interest is epistemology, and he was a real pioneer, along with Bateson as well.
Yeah, never mind Bateson founded the CIA.
So,
yeah, let me just show those guys up here, so people have an idea of who they are. But Korzybski was also tied to William S. Burroughs, so be careful there. He was one of the key people.
Oh, I don't doubt it. I mean, I don't doubt it. You know,
yeah, key people behind cybernetics that was part of the CIA's MK Ultra program. But yeah, I mean, he did some good work that we can understand. And just be aware that Korzybski is one of them.
Oh, without a doubt, all those guys are. Anybody who got press was, you know, and you know, I really appreciate you pointing that out, you know, because once that idea was put out there, I'm like, okay, of course that's what it is. You know, everything falls into place, you know, in that context for me, right? So,
you know what? Let me just interrupt you really quickly here, and then I'll give it back to you. Thank you to Candor, Brian, Uncommon Conspiracies, and King Ravana for your $5 donations. Go ahead, Rod. Sorry about that.
So what Korzybski was all about was pointing attention to our processes of mental abstraction. And he designed this really beautiful visual model for it, and I've got a version of it that I meant to have on hand tonight, but I forgot to grab it. For instance, you know, in his model, it's like the sensory data comes in and hits our sense organs, and this transform happens, right? The map's not the territory. Okay, that, you know, in our visual system, we know that the light hits the lens in the eye and it flips everything upside down, right? And shoots it on the back of the retina upside down. And our nervous system, you know, writes that, and we don't have to first, you know, think the first thing about it. Okay, so that signal comes in, it gets transformed, which is the creation of a new level of abstraction, and then we start making all these meta statements about that input. Okay, so he applies this to the notion of this world that we live in. He says, okay, obviously this world that we live in is a plenum, it's a fullness. Okay, so where is the good reason to create this notion of the void or a vacuum? Okay, and in Western intellectual history, where it shows up, you know, in popular, you know, literature anyway, is with the Greek Democritus, who was the first atomist, right? Who said that, well, you know, what I speculate that's going on, you know, at this lower level of structure in the system is that there's these really hard little particles, and they're floating in nothingness, right? The so-called void, right? Well, where do you get the idea of nothingness? It's only an abstraction you can make from looking at stuff and imagining it in your head, it not being there. Okay, that step in abstraction is exactly what Occam's razor is saying you shouldn't do unless it's absolutely necessary. Okay, so I'll tell you a little story about how this really got traction with me. This process of, you know, watching levels of abstraction. I had the good fortune of training for many years with traditionally trained European heavy timber carpenter, and the techniques that he taught me and that we used, I'm sure real well, you know, virtually the same stuff that the Masons were using, right? The layout techniques and really elegant systems of measurement. And, you know, it's how stuff like the Notre Dame was built, right? Long before you could get a 25-foot Stanley measuring tape, right? So one thing that we did was we built some fairly complex staircases. And instead of using a measuring tape, we would use what's called a story stick. Okay, and it's a long stick, and you put it on your layout, and you pick up marks onto the stick, okay, rather than using a tape measure. Okay, and I asked my teacher, I said, well, you know, why don't we just, you know, use the measuring tape for this instead, you know, messing around with the stick. And what he pointed out was that every step in abstraction is an opportunity for error. Okay, so let's look at what we're doing here. Okay, so the first thing when you're using the story stick, okay, is that you got to make sure it's matched up down on the end, right? And then that first measurement that you take, you're creating this level of abstraction where you're making this mark that corresponds to this point on the layout that you're wanting to pick up, right? When you're using the story stick. Okay, so basically 2 steps in abstraction, and you can make an error in either instance. This is going to screw you up later on. Okay, but when you use a measuring tape, okay, you pull that measuring tape out there, and the first step in abstraction is you're trying to match that point with one of those little black marks on the tape measure, right? And it's real easy. I've done it a million times. Every carpenter has. You pick the wrong one. Okay, so that step in abstraction is an opportunity for error. Okay, and then you have to apply a number to that little mark, 2 feet, 4 inches, whatever it is. Okay, that step is another opportunity for error. Okay, then you got to write it down. That's another step that's another possibility for error. And then you got to unpack this whole thing, right? To actually go mark your cut piece. Okay, so the fewer steps you're taking in abstraction, the fewer opportunities you have for error. And the really, challenging part of making an error in abstraction is then that error gets generalized. Okay, and that is, racism is a good example of that. So Korzybski says there is no good reason to posit the notion of a vacuum as being the fundamental condition, right? Because what Newtonian physics would more than imply is that what we're looking at here is this emptiness with this stuff in it, right?
Well, you can't have one. You can't have one without the other. In order to have an object, you have to have a background. One implies the other.
Well, there's object and background, okay, but this notion that there's such a thing as nothing.
There has to be nothing if there's something, doesn't there?
No, I would say that is a problematic epistemology.
Sure. Well, that's just a concept. It's an unprovable concept anyway.
Right. And there's not, what's his name? Karl Popper, the preeminent philosopher of science of the 20th century, kind of did away with the notion of proof. It's like you can't, the idea that you can prove some scientific idea doesn't hold water because you can't test you can't test every instance, right?
Well, because it's objective, because you have to be able to observe it yourself and recreate the experiment, and so that you can experience it, because your understanding is based on your experience, not on what somebody else experiences. Therefore, truth is objective, right?
Well, the notion of truth, I'm much more on the
or
same
proof.
page.
Sorry, not truth. I meant to say proof.
Well, Popper's notion was that proof is not possible, but disproof is.
Yeah, I like that.
And so the notion, and this is.
And we should point out that Karl Popper was London School of Economics, ladies and gentlemen. So just be aware that this preeminent guy of the last century, London School of Economics, and we get guys like George Soros, Gordon Wasson, David Rockefeller, even the Tavistock Institute of Human Behavior is out of there. So
sure, and it's like with Bateson, for instance, in order to hack something, it really helps to understand it thoroughly, and unfortunately, Bateson developed a really effective model for grokking, for logos land, and then it's been used to abuse. It's unspeakable. So right. Okay. So
I always say proof is for alcohol. It's like there is no such thing as proof. People are like you prove it, man, prove it. It's like, oh wait, hold on a second. The example I like is You know, I walk out to go get my mail in the morning. The neighbor winks at me. I take that as proof that she's into me. My brother takes that as proof that she had something in her eye. Her husband takes that as proof that she, you know, she was conspiring against it. I mean, you know, proof is just a concept that people should get out of their brain.
Interpretation is a delicate thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like yours though. Your interpretation, that's the one I've gone with too.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about the discussions when you get into science is immediately you get all these people that want you to prove a negative or even prove a positive. It's like, come on, all I can do is give you evidence toward my hypothesis. And if my hypothesis can be recreated over and over and over again, then I come up with a theory of the mechanism, and I have a theory, and that's all I can give you. I can't give you.
Yeah, it's still, and the map's not the territory, right? Yeah. So the theory is a mapping that, you know, works, you know, to your satisfaction. I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, and you shouldn't be using magic to make your map. Your map should be a testable, reproducible, step-by-step process using the rational scientific model.
Correct.
That's certainly a big chunk of it.
Now, my beef with ether. Okay, I didn't get into this last time, and I know we don't have a ton of time left, but
yeah, let's wrap it up in the next 9 minutes here.
Yeah, so ether itself, I believe, is a flawed idea. It's a much better idea and much better theory than half of the other theories out there. But the electric nature of the universe doesn't need an explanation of ether in the same respect. You can simplify it even further, and then once you simplify it even further, like Walter Russell's great at kind of dismantling the ether argument. Somebody who does a really good job of pointing that out, just in case people are more interested in this idea, because I don't have time to go into it. Go check out Robert Otey's video about ether. He goes into it in more depth. I would tend to agree with Robert. But anyways, yeah, as far as ether goes, be skeptical of all the things you hear. Going from one theory to another, oftentimes you'll get caught in another net and then another net, and there's multiple nets set up for you. As soon as you get out of this one, you fall in another one, and it takes
the belief system of the month club.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I call them secondary catch webs.
Yeah. Purple pillars. All right, so just to kind of tie this up, another interesting thing here, I got a question I wanted to ask people. If gravity was truly a pull, shouldn't the human pelvis have the least density, since it's the center of the body? Think of a piece of chewing gum being pulled. The two ends are thinner than the center point where it's stretched the most, right? So how would that be possible? Another thing, mountains, stalactites, stalagmites couldn't exist in an environment that's pulling. Same thing like we kind of mentioned, trees are growing against gravity. How are trees growing against gravity? We should have giant bowls of earth material dotting the planet, surrounded by material slowly falling into it if we had pressure pull, or if we had something pulling. Some of these things people should be thinking about. And then getting back to what we were talking about earlier with the barometer. Okay, the first barometer, they just took a pool of water, they took a tube, right? And they fill the tube with water, and the water would go, they open the bottom of the tube and it goes into the reservoir. The reservoir equals out at about 10.3 10.3 feet, right? 10 and a half
meters,
feet.
Centimeters, whatever it was.
Yeah, meters. So the long fought against question is what's taking place here? Is there pressure being pushed down against the water in the reservoir against the other water that's trying to pull into the reservoir? So when you start to understand what's really going on here, there's the actual air pressure around us. It has a density to it, and we forget that it has a density, and that's why people have such a hard time with this concept. They think we need to invent this downward pull to keep us attached to the spinning Earth. It's like, well, hold
Right.
on.
It's not no explanation necessary.
Exactly. Now we don't need. It's like we don't need to complicate things even further and say, oh well, you know, that doesn't this doesn't fit into our theory, so it must be this and this and this and this. We need to go the opposite direction, like you were saying, Occam's razor. Go down to what makes a simple amount of
Keep it
sense.
simple, stupid.
Exactly. So that's why, those are just a bunch of examples I have of, and I have a lot more. I'm sorry we didn't have a lot of more time to get into all the rest of it, but that's, if there's any questions from the audience, we maybe can wrap this up with those.
Anyone? Bueller?
There, it looks like there's a lot of really good. Okay, so one thing real quick. The Electric Universe guys, just be aware that they actively censor out a lot of Walter Russell's material. Start asking those guys like, hey, why aren't you acknowledging that there was a scientist a long time ago who obviously they're really into Velikovsky, right? But there there are some interesting things about Velikovsky. Start questioning the whole. There's a lot of people interested in the Electric Universe, which is cool, but be careful because there are limited hangouts, and there are people trying to capitalize on that information and not let you kind of take it even further. You can take it much further. Same thing when you go and you look at. I keep recommending Walter Russell because I love Walter Russell's diagrams and his charts. Go look at those. They will mind blow you how smart this guy was so long ago. But at the same time, be very critical of the terminologies that he gets into that are not rational. He had that problem as well. Everybody needs to start helping each other out so that we can kind of reword all these terminologies so that we can all understand them without these fantasy words like waves and seventh dimension and stuff. Like what I think Walter Russell meant by his 10 dimensions, I don't think he meant to say dimensions. And a lot of Russellian guys are going to fight me on this. I always get kickback. They always tell me you can't change Russellian science. It's perfect the way it is. It really is kind of like a religion to me. I have to say this on record. I think everybody should be critical of everything. Not, you shouldn't just take anything at face value. But when he said dimension, he's really talking about octaves, more of like musical octaves and harmony. And that's when you start understanding light, sound, and all these different observations we observe in elements, densities, pressures. These are all have the same principles behind them. And Walter Russell did a great job of laying that out. It just needs to be reworded. Same thing with Ken Wheeler. I love the guy, but he keeps using, the same terminologies over and over again. I can always tell people who watch a lot of his videos because they use words like perturbation and acceleration and force and all these different terminologies. It's like, okay, Ken, I would love to see you as well go in and utilize the rational scientific method, get rid of words like force out of your vocabulary, start explaining things simply the way that a child could understand them, because that's when people are going to start to really grasp what you're saying. And that's what I'm working on as far as putting together these puzzle pieces, making them more digestible so that I can give them out there to you guys.
All right, and thanks to everyone who donated and supported the show tonight. Thanks, Polygonal Construction. Thanks for the additional $5 you donated just now. Please also support Caleb at mick.caleb@gmail.com. You can PayPal him directly to that. Once again, that's mick.caleb@gmail.com. And any information you'd like to give out, Rod, if people want to reach out to you?
I'm sure if anybody wants to give me a shout, Rod Smith on Facebook. I'm also the natural philosopher, which is the name of my education project on Facebook. You can find me there as well. And my email is rodsmith40, that's 40 at hotmail.com.
All right. And thanks, everyone. Please support. Thank you for your time, and thanks for tuning in. Please hit the subscribe and the notification bell, and catch us next week. We also try to put out the Unspun, usually every Tuesday if we can at 5 p.m., but we've been doing the Logos Roundtable lately. Hopefully Mark and Steve and all of us can be back next Sunday for this. What did you...
I just wanted to say, if you have any ideas for us, what you'd like us to talk about more, go ahead and throw them in the chat.
Definitely.
In the description.
Send emails as well.
Yeah, we could talk about light. We could talk about time. We could talk about all these different scientific stuff I'm into. Any topic you can think of, we'd like to get into. So,
all right.
Your feedback.
Anything else there, Rod?
No, I think it's, well, just to thank you guys. It was good fun, certainly.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone, and have a good night.
Bye, everyone.